talk about COVID restrictions and free exercise. Kind of a timely topic. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is vaccine mandates. And most vaccine mandates contain a religious exemption. So you might have read in the newspapers this week that the Supreme Court invalidated the Biden administration's regulation that required employees in workforces having over 100 workers to get vaccinated. But it upheld a regulation that hospitals that receive Medicare or Medicaid funds must have their healthcare workers vaccinated. And that regulation had an exemption for religious objectives. But there are a few vaccine mandates that don't have any religious exemption. So there's a New York rule that requires healthcare workers to get vaccinated, and it has no religious exemption. And the way these cases have come up to the Supreme Court is that lower courts have ruled that vaccine mandates are okay, they're lawful. And then the Supreme Court is asked to enjoin, to prohibit these mandates from taking effect. So the Supreme Court has now decided a number of cases on an emergency basis involving COVID restrictions. And one of the cases involved a Maine rule, executive order promulgated by Maine's governor that requires all healthcare workers to get vaccinated. And there's an exemption for medical reasons. So if you have a doctor's letter saying that there are good grounds to think that vaccination might be a threat to the person's health, then the mandate is lifted. But there's no religious exemption. So we can ask, does the failure to have an exemption for religious objectors violate the free exercise rights of those objectors? So one question, it's the free exercise of religion. And so you hear a lot of things, objections to vaccine mandates that don't seem to be religiously based. Like, I lifted these from social media. The final variant is called communism. That's an objection to the role of the government. It doesn't really seem to be rooted in any religious view. Or, I have an immune system. That's an objection that is based on the supposed inefficacy or unnecessary nature of the vaccine. It's based on a view of the facts rather than any clear religious view. And also, isn't it kind of a silly objection? Aren't there hundreds of thousands of people who have had immune systems and were unvaccinated and who died from COVID? I don't really quite understand this objection. Okay, so, the basis for the religious objection is that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines ultimately can be traced to cells involving aborted fetuses. So the vaccines themselves don't use cells of aborted fetuses or descended from aborted fetuses, but in developing the vaccine, Moderna and Pfizer use cells that were descended from the fetuses that were aborted decades ago. So there are other vaccines that also use cells descended from aborted fetuses decades ago. Yeah, did you?
Has there ever been a question raised as far as, aren't there a number of practicing Catholics on the Supreme Court? Has there anyone ever thought of that as a conflict?
Yeah, so The Catholic Church's position is that it's okay to use vaccines that involve cells that ultimately descend from aborted fetuses if there are no other vaccines for the particular malady available. So the Catholic Church, doesn't oppose the use of the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine. So that raises the question that I pose up on the board, which is free exercise inapplicable because religious objections to vaccines are somehow wrong or incoherent? Or picking up on your point, let's say that a Catholic objects to the vaccine mandate on the grounds that the cells descend from aborted fetuses. Is it a good response to say, sorry, that objection doesn't work because you're a Catholic and the position of your church is to the contrary? And the answer is no. Courts don't adjudicate the rectitude of religious beliefs, nor do they require that the religious belief correspond with the view of an established religion. So it wouldn't disqualify the free exercise objection to say, oh, well, the position of your church is to the contrary. Free exercise also guarantees one's right to dissent from the official pronouncements of one's church. The only constraint is sincerity. And, I think there are arguable bases to question the sincerity of objections, supposedly religious objections to vaccine mandates. This is one of my concerns. If you have a religious exemption, people will use it as kind of a catch-all for depositing objections that really are not based on religion, but based on a view about the proper role of government, or misguided views about the efficacy of vaccine, misguided factual views. So you could say, many objectors haven't objected to the chickenpox vaccines or rubella vaccines, which also involved the descendant cells of aborted fetuses. So, look, you're not being consistent, your views are not sincere. And as I said, objections on social media seem largely focused not on aborted fetuses, but on government overreaching or misguided factual views. Say, those aren't religious views. But, there are some people who sincerely object to the COVID vaccines on the grounds that they use cells descended from aborted fetuses. And abortion is a grave moral wrong, is murder. So we can ask, assuming that there are sincere religious objections, does free exercise require their accommodation? So under the Warren Court's burdens test, I think the answer is probably yes. The vaccine mandates clearly burden religious belief, the belief that that's a grave moral wrong to promote abortion in any way by using the fruits of abortion for purposes of medical research or vaccines. So the burden would shift to the government to show that the vaccine mandate, as applied to religious objectives, is necessary to promote some compelling governmental objective. And certainly saving lives is a compelling governmental objective. But the question would be whether the government has other ways to save lives. So requiring religious objectors to wear masks, socially distance, or in the case of healthcare workers, not have direct contact with patients or undergo regular testing. All of those alternatives might be effective in saving lives, and they wouldn't require religious objectors to violate their religious beliefs. So what about under the current discrimination test? So the main rule was challenged. It went up to the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, which encompasses the northeastern states. And a majority of the First Circuit judges sitting on the case concluded that there was no discrimination. The main vaccine mandate applied to everyone. And it doesn't matter whether you objected to the mandate on secular grounds. It involves government overreaching, or the vaccines are ineffective, dangerous, or you object on religious grounds. In either case, your objection doesn't suffice to overcome the mandate. So it's neutral respecting religion. It treats secular objections and religious objections in the same way. Case goes up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court declines to stop the main rule from taking effect. But 3 justices dissent, and in their view, the main rule does discriminate, because on the one hand, it allows some secular objections, medical, it has a medical exemption. So if you have a letter from a doctor saying that the vaccine might endanger your health, you're not subject to the mandate. But if you have religious objections, then you have to comply with the mandate. In the eyes of these 3 justices, Gorsuch, Alito, and Thomas, this involves religious discrimination against religion as such. Douglas County is now under a mask mandate, and there is a medical exemption. So if wearing a mask would endanger your health in some way, you're exempt from the mask mandate. And also religious services are exempt from the mask mandate. So the Douglas County mask mandate doesn't involve the same arguable constitutional problem that the main vaccine mandate does. Yeah.
Yeah, I just when I looked at your bullet point regarding Thomas and Gorsuch and Alito, I sort of wonder how. I mean, it looks to me like they're sort of establishing. They're becoming more proponents of establishing a religion, and I'm never mind the fact that we all have religious rights in this country. But what I fail to see from their point of view is how do they correlate a public health emergency, which has to be addressed, and how can they say that this is not a public health emergency, like say with the mandate of employers with over 100 employees?
Yeah, I mean, great question. Once one concludes that the government is discriminating against religious practice as such, and these 3 justices concluded that the government was discriminating, right? Allowed medical objections, secular medical objections on the one hand, disallowed religious objections on the other. In their eyes, that's discrimination. So then the burden shifts to the government. And I'm going to use some legal mumbo jumbo now. But what happens is that the court uses a standard of review called strict scrutiny. So the government has to show that the restriction is the least restrictive means of advancing a compelling governmental objective. So you're saying, what the hell? Saving lives is a compelling governmental objective. And these justices have no quarrel with that. How could they? But the real question is whether the government has less restrictive means. So does the government have alternative ways of saving lives that don't encroach on the beliefs of religious objectors, don't require religious objectors to do something they find to be a grave moral wrong? So you know, the Maine would have to come in and show, look, we have staffing shortages. Here's the evidence. You know, it would be great if we could allow religious objectors not to have direct patient contact and use masks, socially distance, and undergo regular testing. We don't live in that ideal world. Giving our staffing shortages, it's all hands on deck. Everybody, we need these people to have direct patient contact. And here's our evidence that allowing unvaccinated persons to have direct patient contact endangers the lives of the patients who are being served. And if Maine could make that showing, that there are no equally effective alternatives, then the vaccine mandate would be upheld as applied to religious objectors. Yeah?
I'm trying to remember in constitutional construction of the Bill of Rights, where is the right of one individual that results in harm to another individual? Is that in the Constitution itself, in the Bill of Rights, and how does a separate right get pulled in, and it may be in the debating within the Supreme Courts or whatever level of the court the argument goes to, but you know, what's a priori, or what's the starting point, starting lens? Is my question kind of?
Yeah, so, you know, take freedom of speech, for instance.
Yeah.
You know, you could look at what the Constitution says about freedom of speech. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. Oh, that means if there's a law abridging freedom of speech, it's a violation of free speech. But, you know, speech can cause harm. And the famous example is falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater. So what the Supreme Court has not treated rights as absolute. You know, you can say, oh, well, compelling somebody who believes that the use of fetal cells is a grave moral wrong to have a vaccine produced with the descendants of fetal cells, that's a violation of free exercise. End of story. It doesn't matter what kind of harm to others is caused. But the Supreme Court has said, no, our view of rights is not absolute. The interests of others count. So a presumptive free exercise violation can be overcome if the government can show that it's necessary to promote a compelling governmental objective.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And then the sincerity test is when it gets dicey, at perhaps even a local level, or if something that doesn't raise up to, because you'll hear people talk about in terms of freedom of religion, well, what does religion mean? And what do I claim, because I'm really an anti-something, and I'm going to claim religion. Well, if an ELCA Lutheran claims religious objection, they're going to have a difficult time proving that. Someone else, it may be easy to show, but the sincerity part of it, that's tough to look at a local level. But
Yeah, you know, if you look at the judicial decisions, you know, very few of them question the sincerity of professed religious belief. You know, they just kind of accept the assertion that the belief is predicated upon religion. And I think in most contexts that makes sense. But as I was suggesting, in this context, the danger is that people will use a religious exemption to deposit their political views.
correct.
Or their factual views that are not really predicated on religion. So what I would like to see, if we have religious exemptions, I would like to see those in charge with policing use of the exemption to you know, take a close look at the sincerity of the objection. So if somebody's Facebook page is filled with stuff like this, and it has nothing about aborted fetuses, I think, a court would be justified in concluding that the religious objection is a make-weight. It's not sincere. Yeah.
So you've talked a lot about how government action affects private individuals, and private individuals implicate the First Amendment for protection. When you're dealing with a church, a private entity, non-governmental, does any of that have any application to our behavior as far as like mandating masks?
No. I teach Con Law 101, and one of the fundamental principles that I teach my students is that the individual rights in the Constitution constrain only the action of governmental actors, not private actors. So the church can exclude persons who hold differing views without violating freedom of speech. Freedom of speech doesn't apply to a church because the church is a private rather than a governmental actor. And the same thing is true with free exercise. So, a church could require that its members get vaccinated without violating the free exercise of religion because, again, the church is a private rather than a governmental actor.
Thank you.
Okay, so, so much for vaccine mandates. Anything else about vaccine mandates? Yeah.